In the heart of the American Midwest, where endless wheat fields meet the open sky, there once thrived a town built on steel rails and raw ambition. Riverton was born in the 1880s as a vital stop on the Great Transcontinental Railroad. Freight trains thundered through day and night. The depot buzzed with passengers, workers, and dreamers. Grain elevators towered like cathedrals. Main Street hummed with hotels, shops, and the steady rhythm of railroad life. But progress moved on. By the late 20th century, the major railroads rerouted. New interstate highways bypassed the town completely. The last passenger train left in 1998. The freight yard fell silent. One by one, businesses boarded up their windows. Families moved away in search of work. The grand old depot, once the pride of Riverton, became a crumbling monument to what used to be. Weeds grew between the rusting tracks. The population dropped from over 5,000 to barely 180 stubborn souls who refused to leave. Riverton wasn't just struggling. It was bankrupt, officially declared insolvent by the state. The town's debts were crushing. Its infrastructure was collapsing. Most outsiders wrote it off as another casualty of modern America, a railroad town that had outlived its purpose. Then, in the spring of 2021, one man saw something completely different. His name was Lucas Bennett, 38-year-old American industrial engineer, short dark hair, light stubble beard, wearing dark blue work shirt, brown leather jacket, dark jeans, brown work boots. A logistics expert from Minneapolis, Lucas had spent his career optimizing supply chains and rail networks for large corporations. He understood railroads better than most. But he was tired of working for systems that abandoned places like Riverton. Lucas first heard about the town while reviewing old rail maps for a consulting project. Something about Riverton's location, sitting at the crossroads of two historic rail lines with direct access to major grain-producing regions, caught his attention. While everyone else saw failure, he saw untapped potential. He made the 4-hour drive from Minneapolis one quiet weekend. As he rolled into Riverton, the sight was heartbreaking. Empty streets, boarded-up storefronts. The once majestic depot stood silent with broken windows and graffiti. Rusting freight cars sat forgotten on sidings. The grain elevators loomed empty against the prairie sky. Yet Lucas noticed the bones were still strong. The tracks, though neglected, were mostly intact. The depot had solid architecture. The town's layout was perfect for logistics. In his mind, he could already hear the sound of trains again, whistles echoing across the plains, bringing life, jobs, and opportunity back to Riverton. Most people would have turned around and driven home. Lucas did the opposite. He started digging into the finances. The town was being auctioned off in pieces to cover massive debts. Lucas made a bold, all-in offer. He would purchase the entire bankrupt railroad town, the depot, the rail yards, the grain elevators, and a significant portion of the commercial district, in one sweeping deal. The local officials were stunned. Some laughed openly at the meeting. Another dreamer thinking he can bring back the glory days, they said. Newspapers ran skeptical headlines. Even his own friends warned him he was throwing his life savings away on a lost cause. But Lucas had done the math. He believed in the numbers. He believed in the location. Most importantly, he believed in second chances. After intense negotiations and navigating complex bankruptcy proceedings, the deal closed. For a fraction of what it would cost to build new infrastructure from scratch, Lucas Bennett became the owner of an entire bankrupt railroad town. On the day he signed the final papers, Lucas stood alone on the cracked platform of the old depot. The prairie wind whipped through his brown leather jacket. He ran his hand along the cold steel rail and spoke quietly to the empty yard. They can laugh all they want. Soon, these tracks are going to sing again. He had no idea how difficult the journey ahead would be. The real battle, against nature, against doubt, and against time, was only just beginning. The first 18 months in Riverton were a brutal test of will. Lucas Bennett moved into the old depot building itself, converting a small office into a makeshift living space. There was no reliable heat, the roof leaked during spring rains, and the silence at night was deafening. The only sounds were the prairie wind rattling loose windows and the occasional creak of the old wooden structure settling. He started with the most critical task, making the main rail line usable again. Armed with engineering knowledge but limited funds, Lucas Bennett, 38-year-old American industrial engineer, short dark hair, light stubble beard, wearing dark blue work shirt, brown leather jacket, dark jeans, brown work boots, spent his days walking the tracks, marking damaged sections, clearing decades of overgrowth, and replacing rotting ties wherever he could afford to. The physical work was punishing. Lifting heavy rails in the blazing summer sun left him exhausted. Winters brought freezing temperatures that made metal tools burn to the touch. His hands developed deep calluses, and his dark blue work shirt was constantly stained with grease, dirt, and sweat. Money drained faster than expected. Replacing even a short section of track cost far more than his projections. A surprise flood damaged a bridge he had just reinforced. Suppliers demanded payment up front because of the town's bankrupt reputation. By the end of the first winter, Lucas had burned through most of his savings and was surviving on ramen and black coffee. The remaining locals were divided. Some offered quiet help. An elderly retired rail worker named Hank showed him how to read old signal systems. Others were openly skeptical. "Kid, the railroads left us for a reason," they'd say. A few even started rumors that Lucas was just another outsider trying to flip the property for profit. Doubt crept in during the hardest nights. Lucas would sit alone on the depot platform under a single bare bulb, staring at the silent, rusting tracks stretching into the darkness. He questioned whether he had thrown away his future on a fantasy. One particularly cold February night, after a major storm bent several sections of newly repaired track, he stood in the snow and wondered if it was time to admit defeat. Yet something kept him going. He began posting raw, unpolished videos of his progress online. One man in a bankrupt town trying to bring the railroad back to life. The response started small, but grew steadily. Railroad enthusiasts, engineers, and people who loved revival stories began commenting and sharing. A few skilled volunteers drove hundreds of miles to help for a weekend. A retired locomotive mechanic from Kansas arrived with his tools and stayed for 3 months. Small victories started appearing. Lucas managed to clear and repair a 2-mile section of main line. When he successfully ran a small test locomotive, borrowed from a preservation society, down the newly stabilized track for the first time in over 20 years, the sound of that lone whistle echoing across the prairie brought tears to his eyes and to the few locals who came to watch. By the second spring, momentum was building. Lucas restored the exterior of the old depot, replacing broken windows and giving the historic building a fresh coat of paint while keeping its authentic character. He cleared the main rail yard of overgrown brush and scrap. A small grain cooperative, impressed by his progress, signed a preliminary agreement to start shipping through Riverton again if the line could handle it. Still, the challenges continued. Another harsh storm damaged signaling equipment. Cash flow remained tight. But Lucas kept pushing forward, often working from sunrise until long after dark, his brown leather jacket tossed over a fence post during the hardest labor. One quiet evening as the sun set over the endless fields, Lucas Bennett stood on the repaired section of track, the test locomotive idling in the distance. The wind tugged gently at his jacket. For the first time in many months, he allowed himself a small, tired smile. The tracks were no longer completely silent. But the real transformation, the return of regular trains, jobs, and a thriving town, was still ahead. The breakthrough arrived in the 3rd year, and it changed everything. With growing online support and several small grants secured through railroad preservation programs, Lucas Bennett launched the full restoration of the main line. Professional track crews were brought in for the most technical sections, but Lucas worked right alongside them. 38-year-old American industrial engineer, short dark hair, light stubble beard, wearing dark blue work shirt, brown leather jacket, dark jeans, brown work boots, his hands still deeply involved in the labor. He personally oversaw the replacement of over 8 miles of track, the repair of 2 aging bridges, and the complete modernization of the signaling system while preserving the historic character of the line. The old grain elevators, long silent, received critical structural repairs. New loading equipment was installed. The depot was fully restored inside and out, the grand waiting hall cleaned and polished, historic ticket counters brought back to life, and modern safety features added without destroying its soul. Lucas poured his remaining resources into making Riverton functional again, not just for nostalgia, but for real economic purpose. Then the trains began to return. First came short test runs carrying grain from local cooperatives. The sight of loaded freight cars rolling slowly into the revived yard was emotional for everyone who witnessed it. A major regional grain company signed a long-term contract to ship through Riverton, citing the restored line's strategic location and lower costs compared to trucking everything to distant hubs. More contracts followed. Within months, freight traffic increased dramatically. The rail yard, once a graveyard of rusting cars, became busy with switching operations again. Economic transformation followed quickly. Jobs returned. The grain elevators needed workers. The depot required staff for operations and maintenance. Local mechanics opened a small locomotive repair shop in one of the old warehouses. Restaurants and shops on Main Street began reopening as people had money to spend again. Families who had left years earlier started coming back, some to visit, many to stay permanently. Abandoned houses were repaired and occupied. Children's laughter returned to the streets. Lucas made deliberate choices to keep the revival authentic and sustainable. He offered affordable leases to small businesses and prioritized local hiring. He worked with the remaining town council to update infrastructure gradually. A weekend farmers market appeared in the old depot square, drawing visitors from surrounding counties who wanted to see the miracle railroad town they had read about online. The emotional peak came on a bright autumn morning during the official reopening ceremony. Hundreds gathered at the restored depot. String lights decorated the platform. A restored vintage steam locomotive, brought in for the occasion, stood proudly on the tracks, its brass gleaming in the sunlight. Local musicians played old railroad songs. Speeches were given, but the most powerful moment was when Lucas Bennett stepped up to the microphone. Wearing his signature dark blue work shirt and brown leather jacket, his light stubble now showing the first traces of gray from years of stress and hard work, Lucas spoke with quiet strength. He thanked the volunteers, the locals who had stayed, and everyone who had believed when others laughed. This town wasn't bankrupt because it had no value, he said. It was bankrupt because people stopped believing in it. Today, these tracks prove that belief can bring life back. As the vintage locomotive blew its whistle and slowly pulled out of the station with a ceremonial load of grain, the entire crowd cheered. Many cried openly. Lucas stood on the platform, watching the train disappear into the golden prairie, the sound of steel wheels on rails filling the air once again. In the months that followed, Riverton continued its remarkable comeback. The population grew steadily toward 1,200 and kept rising. New businesses opened, a craft brewery in an old warehouse, a logistics company using the rail connection, even a small bed and breakfast in the restored depot annex. Tourism increased as railroad enthusiasts and history lovers visited to ride excursion trains and learn the story of the town that refused to die. Lucas walked the busy rail yard most evenings now, watching freight cars being loaded and unloaded under floodlights. He saw young families moving into repaired homes. He saw grandparents teaching grandchildren about the history of the rails. He saw a town that had once been declared dead, now pulsing with life and possibility. There were still challenges ahead, maintenance costs, weather threats, market fluctuations, but Riverton now had momentum, infrastructure, and most importantly, a renewed spirit. On a quiet evening 2.5 years after he first arrived, Lucas Bennett stood alone on the depot platform as the sun set over the endless fields. A long freight train rumbled past, its cars loaded with grain, its whistle echoing into the distance. The wind gently tugged at his brown leather jacket. He thought back to the day everyone laughed at his crazy purchase, to the freezing nights of doubt, to the back-breaking labor and the moments he nearly quit. The journey had cost him dearly in money, time, and energy, but it had given him something priceless, the chance to prove that abandoned places still deserve a future. Lucas Bennett didn't just buy a bankrupt railroad town. He brought its heart and soul back to life. Today, Riverton stands as a powerful symbol of resilience and vision. The trains run again. Jobs have returned. Families are building futures here. What was once mocked as a foolish dream has become a living testament to what one determined person can achieve when they choose to believe in a place everyone else has given up on. As the camera slowly pulls back over the glowing depot, the busy rail yard, and the thriving town against the vast prairie sky, one truth rings louder than the sound of the trains. No town is truly dead as long as someone is willing to fight for its second chance. Lucas Bennett heard the call of those silent tracks and answered it. And in doing so, he reminded us all that sometimes the greatest opportunities are found exactly where others have stopped looking.